What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we are looking at the game Hikaru Nakamura versus Ding Liren from the 2024 Norway Chess Classic. Now, in case your name is Patrick Starr and you've been living under a rock for the past 2 years, Ding Liren is getting ready to defend his World Championship title this year in November, and so far this year, Ding has been struggling big time. However, Ding Liren did have a very good showing overall at the Norway Chess Classic, and in this game against Hikaru Nakamura, we finally saw a glimpse of Ding Liren's old form. In the game, Hikaru unleashed some crazy opening preparation in the Nimzo-Indian defense against Ding Liren, but Ding Liren came ready for a fight. He was like Rocky Balboa in this game. No matter how many times he got punched in the face, he just kept on fighting back. And trust me, Ding Liren is going to shock you with some of the crazy ideas he comes up with in this game. Now, in the game, Hikaru is playing as white. He opens 1d4, and from there we get a Nimzo-Indian on the board with the moves knight c3 and then bishop b4. Now from here, white has a ton of different options, but in the game, Hikaru goes for the very dangerous line, starting with e3 and then bishop to d2. Now the idea behind this move is very simple. Black in a lot of lines is threatening to give white double pawns after bishop takes c3, and then white has to recapture with the b pawn, b takes c3. For example, instead of e3, if white plays a3 on move 4, then after bishop takes b takes, we get that classical doubled pawn structure in the Nimzo-Indian. But instead, after the move bishop d2, Hikaru never has to worry about those doubled pawns, as he can always recapture with the bishop. Of course, there is a downside to this idea that bishop is now locked inside the pawn chain and is never getting outside of there, and that means white's pieces are always going to be a little bit less active than they could have been. However, as we'll see, this line still gives Hikaru some very dangerous attacking ideas. Okay, from here, Ding Liren plays the strongest idea. That's where you go d5 followed by b6. So what is Ding's idea? Well, he starts d5 to get that firm stake in the center of the board, and then he follows up b6. That bishop is going to go to the b7 square, and that bishop is going to be a key piece in black's position. From there, that bishop indirectly supports the e4 square, which helps black go knight e4, increasing his control over the center of the board. Okay, Hikaru, what does he do in response? Well, he plays the most complicated line, and that is the one starting with c takes d5. Now, after black recaptures, we have an imbalance in the pawn structure. This is known as a Carlsbad structure. It's very common in the Queen's Gambit decline, specifically the exchange variation of the QGD. Now, typically in the Queen's Gambit decline, white is going to have that bishop outside the pawn chain. However, in this line, it is behind it, and that does make it easier for black to equalize in this game, but again, it's still very complicated stuff. Now, from here, Hikaru goes bishop d3. That is the best square for the bishop, and Ding Liren responds bishop d6. That bishop at any point could have been hit by the move a3, so he simply retreats it early back to the d6 square, and d6 is the best and most aggressive square for that bishop, so very solid choice by Ding Liren. Now, so far, both players have played the absolute main line, but this is where Hikaru Nakamura decides to spice things up. From here, the main line simply involves playing castles, then rook c1, and perhaps playing for an idea like knight to e5. However, in the game, Hikaru immediately jumps forward with the knight to the b5 square, knight b5, just pressuring that bishop on d6. Now, Ding Liren does not want to lose that bishop for the knight. That bishop is just too important, so he retreats bishop e7. Now, Hikaru castles, and Ding Liren breaks on the queen side with the move c5. Now, already, this is a very combative idea by Ding Liren. The idea is if white captures the pawn on c5, you can either recapture with the bishop or that pawn on b6. And either way, we get a very double-edged pawn structure. Let's say black takes back with the bishop. Then we have that isolated d pawn on the d5 square. On the other hand, if Ding Liren takes back with the b pawn, then he's going to have hanging pawns on the b5 and d5 squares. So Ding Liren with the move c5 is willing to accept a compromised pawn structure in return for fighting for the initiative. Now Hikaru, he goes knight to e5, jumping forward with that knight. This is a very strong idea in the Nimzo-Indian. Here, Hikaru has ideas of following up with the move f2 to f4 and potentially starting a kingside attack. So what does Ding do to stop it? Well, he starts bishop b7, the best square for the bishop. Then rook c1 for Hikaru and rook e8 for Ding. So far, both sides are just continuing to build their position and get the rest of their pieces out into the game. Now Hikaru, knight c3. That knight served his purpose on b5, kicking that bishop back from the d6 square. But now it simply retreats, as he does not want that knight getting hit by the move a6 at some point with a gain of tempo on the knight. Okay. Okay, from here, both sides continue to build. Ding Liren gets the knight out. Then Hikaru has the very cool idea of going knight to e2, and then on the next move, bishop to c3. So this move of bishop to c3 is technically not the strongest move in the position. However, this was likely part of Hikaru Nakamura's computer preparation, and that means Ding Liren has to find all the best moves to hang on. Okay, in the game, Ding Liren takes the knight on e5. This was a critical decision. However, already this might have been a mistake. Instead, the best move here is the move c4, hitting that bishop and forcing it to retreat. Then, after bishop c2, the best follow-up is the move b5, trying to gain space on the queen side and threatening the move b4. I mean, from here, things are just completely crazy. White's going to go f4, trying to launch a kingside attack. Meanwhile, black is going to go b4 and a5, trying to push that queenside pawn majority down the board and create threats on the queen side. But instead of that, knight takes e5 on the board, and already this is starting to justify Hikaru's idea. It looks like Ding Liren may have been caught off guard after all. Okay, in the game, Hikaru takes back, d takes e5. Ding Liren jumps forward with the knight, knight to e4. Again, we're seeing the benefits of having that bishop placed on the b7 square. From b7, it is supporting that knight on e4. I mean, for example, instead of that, if Ding were to go knight to d7, the other logical looking square for the knight, that is just so passive. Now the knight is further away from the king side, and Hikaru is going to have ideas based on f4 and starting a kingside attack. So knight e4, excellent move from Ding Liren, the world champion. Now in this position, what is Hikaru supposed to do? Well, he has a few different options. First of all, the threat from Ding is he is threatening to simply take that bishop on the c3 square. Now if Hikaru were to allow that to happen, that would be a huge loss for him. That bishop on the c3 is just so important for him. So with that in mind, his two main options are taking the knight on e4 with the bishop or retreating the other bishop back to the e1 square. Now in the game, this is what Hikaru does. He goes bishop e1, simply retreating. Now, very quickly, if Hikaru were to take on e4, black would take back, and suddenly Ding Liren has a big advantage in the game. That pawn on e4 is just cramping white's position, and Ding Liren has the bishop pair here. And in the long run, Ding Liren's two bishops are likely to prove stronger than Hikaru's bishop and knight. Okay, after knight e4, Hikaru does go bishop to e1, simply retreating that bishop to that safe e1 square. Now that bishop may look passive on e1, but it can always jump back into the game on c3, for example. Now from here, Ding Liren presses. He goes c4. This virtually forces the exchange of the bishop for the knight. I mean, retreating that bishop to the c2 or b1 squares would be so passive, so Hikaru Nakamura immediately takes the knight on e4. Bishop takes, then d takes. Now a couple moves earlier, we saw a position that was very similar to this, that was very good for Ding Liren, and in that position, Ding Liren still had his pawn on the c5 square. However, here the pawn is on c4, and that changes absolutely everything. Now that knight on e2 has access to the d4 square, as it's no longer being controlled by the pawn on c5, and for that reason, Hikaru Nakamura is starting to look pretty good here. Now, what does Hikaru do? He starts bishop c3, reactivating the bishop. That bishop is now a monster on the c3 square. I mean, just imagine a scenario where that pawn on e5 were to go to e6. Suddenly, that bishop would slice through the board to the black king. Now, Ding Liren b5, supporting the pawn on c4 with his pawn. And now Hikaru goes bishop to d4. Okay, Ding a5. He has the pawn majority on the queen side, and he's doing everything he can to get those pawns rolling down the board. Now, knight f4 from Hikaru and bishop c5 from Ding, activating that bishop. And from here, both players decide it is time to bail out to an endgame. The queens come off the board, and Ding Liren did a fantastic job surviving Hikaru Nakamura's computer preparation. He may even have a slight edge in this position, and the main reason for that is his pawn majority on the queen side. Ding Liren has very good chances to create a passed pawn on the queen side with his 3 queenside pawns versus Hikaru's 2. However, Hikaru is a fighter, and he starts fighting back with his rook pawns. He starts with the move h4. This move looks ridiculous, but he might be going h5 to h6 in the future, trying to gain more space on the king side. Now Ding takes the pawn on e5, and Hikaru goes a4. What the heck am I looking at? Hikaru going all out with these rook pawns. Oh my goodness. All right, bishop c6 from Ding, simply defending that pawn with the bishop. And from here, I'm not sure what to make of this, but Hikaru, despite being a pawn down, really started to press in this endgame. I mean, he starts by activating the rook, rook. And from there, he just presses and presses. He takes on b5. Then he gets his knight back into the game via e2, and then eventually the c3 square with knight c3. Now, again, it looks like Ding Liren is better here with the extra pawn, but it's very hard to hang on to it. And somehow Hikaru ends up liquidating all the pawns on the queen side, and he ends up being a pawn up in the endgame. I mean, Ding takes on c3, but then Hikaru rook takes e4, and we transition to a single rook endgame for both players. And Hikaru Nakamura has the extra pawn on the king side with decent winning chances. And despite pressing for another 20 moves, Hikaru Nakamura was unable to finish off Ding. Ding defended, and on move 80, both players agreed to a draw.